Hi all, and thanks for being with me. I'm going to have a conversation with you today about Australia Day because, firstly, next week, next Friday, is Australia Day. Now, those of you that ever watch my videos from overseas won't give a rat's ass about Australia Day, and that's okay because neither do Australians really. Now, I was at golf this morning and having a conversation with three of my mates in relation to Australia Day. It was a very short-lived conversation, I need to add, because they thought that Australia Day should stay as it is and couldn't understand for 1 minute what it meant to anybody else, particularly if you're Indigenous. But it's that I want to talk about. The only thing I ever disagree with when we're playing golf is how to play golf. But on this occasion, wasn't going to argue with the guys, love them dearly. They're good mates. They put up with me every Friday, so I thought I'd persevere and not create a stir. So I didn't. I backed away. But I want to talk about Australia Day and what it means to us. And I guess my three mates were indicative of what most Australians would think in terms of Australia Day. Let's not do away with it. We're all Australians. There is no reason. What is it that Indigenous people want, even though most people have never asked an Indigenous person what they want on that particular day? Should we rename it? What should we rename it to if we were to rename Australia Day? And I wanted to, because I think that we should change the significance of Australia Day to something else. Now, whatever it is that we call it remains an open-ended question, I guess. But why do we have it in the first place? Well, it's interesting to note that for most of us, what do we do on Australia Day? Well, it's usually a public holiday, and we generally go out, and for many Australians, they get pissed, have a barbecue, spend some time with their family, if they have one, or spend time on their own. But the idea about Australia Day, which is the day that we were colonised by the British, seems to be irrelevant to the whole total thing. So what does it mean on the day that the British arrived here and colonised this country? Now, it doesn't matter where we come from. The fact is that this is our history. It doesn't matter where we arrived in Australia last year, became citizens of Australia the year before, or we were born here. It doesn't matter. The history of this country tells us that in, what year was it now? Because I always forget. 1788, I think. In 1788, Captain Phillip arrived on our shores after Cook had done his thing, gone back home, told him what a great and vacant country we are, and no one lived there. So you may just as well send you the worst possible people you could find, send them to Australia, which they did. Thank God for that. So people that had stolen bread, who had done some terrible, terrible things according to the culture of the time, pickpockets maybe, but the worst of the worst in the British culture, in the British society, was sent to Australia. And they were sent as far away as you could possibly get. The only other place they could have been sent to further away would have been Antarctica. However, they didn't do that. Now, the thing about this is that the British landed on our shores, on Australian shores, stating that there weren't any inhabitants of the land, hence terra nullius. Now, we all know that firstly that's a lie. There were Indigenous people here. And those Indigenous people had their land taken from them. And there's just, look, no matter how much you look at this, there is no other way that you could see it. A foreign country arrives in a foreign land and decides, for whatever reason, because there aren't any people there apparently, that is their land. So they claim it as their land. Now, I wonder how you and I would respond if some foreign country, say China, chose to land in Australia, plant their flag and say from now on, this country is our country. I wouldn't imagine there's one Australian who would even agree with that as a reasonable notion, that we would fight back, that we would not tolerate another country coming in and taking over. In fact, we see it all the time, don't we? I mean, if we imagine for a moment what happened in Gaza happened to us, because what happened in Gaza happened to Indigenous people. It was over 2 centuries ago, but it still happened. Now, none of us would accept that. I was watching an interview or a commentary from my favourite TV station, which is Sky News, and there was a guy on there saying, and this is an old argument, and I think this argument's bizarre. So the argument is, well, Indigenous people should be grateful for what we have provided them. Okay, well, let's list some of the things that we have provided. Let's think about the things that Indigenous people may have had before colonisation, right? Well, they had their version of community, a very strong community. They had a sense of connection, a spiritual connection to their land, right? They had their own ways, their own medicines, their own cures. They had their own way of resolving disputes. They had a sense of community that none of us, no one even bothered to find out what it was that they could offer. They had a sense of land management that we could learn from today, in fact. And in some areas, we're attempting to do that. But the reality was, they had a lot of stuff that worked for Indigenous people. They had the boomerang. They had a way by which they could throw a stick and that stick would return back to them. There's no other, as far as I know, no other culture on earth that was that clever. So, but when the white person arrived and noticed these coloured people and decided that they were to be displaced. Now, what did we offer them? Well, when you think about it, back in 1788, they would have arrived on ships, which clearly Indigenous people didn't have. They had canoes, right? And they had their own form of transport between islands or whatever. But they didn't have ships such as the ones that Philip arrived in. And of course, Philip also had guns and ammunitions and could blast the crap out of people with those large balls that they had in those ships. So that's kind of about it. And the people that were colonising could have learned from Indigenous people how to manage this land better, but they didn't, because they saw them as primitive individuals, and they weren't. So what did they offer? What did the colonisers offer Indigenous people? Well, because they were the worst of the worst, because they were subhuman, not very much. In fact, what we did give them were diseases they didn't have before, which killed them by the tens of thousands. We had alcohol, which destroyed them. We had a whole host of things that Indigenous people had not experienced at all, which were ultimately damaging to them. We shipped them from certain locations where they were accustomed to eating certain foods, and their diet was settled on those foods. And we put them into places where they were eating foods which didn't fit with them, which brought about diabetes and some cancers. So what we did was, we also chose to eradicate them. And many of us forget that there was a policy which was about getting rid of all indigeneity. So assimilate them as much as we can into our culture, and the churches participated in that by taking kids off their land, placing them in orphanages and in other places, and then we decided that the best thing for them to do was to find white homes in which to live so they could assimilate faster. So so when I asked this question about what it is that we've done for Indigenous people, this dude, this character who said, well, you know, we've got, you know, all this technology, all this sort of other stuff, I think, well, when they landed, no, you didn't. There wasn't any of that stuff, right? Were Indigenous people far more advanced than the colonisers at that time? In many areas, they were. Left them for dead. Not figurative, that's only figuratively, I hasten to add. But, you know, and then we spent a lot of time just trying to wipe out Indigenous people. So when I think of Australia Day, I think of it in terms of a day in which the colonisers, the British people, arrived in order to eradicate Indigenous people from this land. That is what it means to me. Now, many Australians will say, okay, but Australia Day is this day of patriotism, you know, which is a terrible term, hate it. I think it's so Americanised, it just makes me sick. But it's a day when we should celebrate what Australia means. And I keep thinking to myself, what does Australia mean then? If this is our history, and these are the facts, then actually what does Australia Day mean? Because it doesn't mean anything to me in terms of that history. When I look at the history and think about that deeply, I can't understand what Australia Day means. Now, we live in a great country. We have fantastic freedoms. We have universal health care. We have lots of stuff which has come about in the last 20, 30 years, you know, in terms of our healthcare, that is. And we have, you know, we elect our politicians. We're as democratic a society as you can imagine. It's not perfect, far from it. After all, we do have Dutton as an opposition leader. But nevertheless, it is a good system. We have a diverse country. But the diversity of this country was here for hundreds of thousands of years, right? We have a beautiful country. Our country is as beautiful as they come. And it's been that way for hundreds of thousands of years. So none of that is about, so that stuff can be celebrated because that's who our country is now and who our country has always been. And we should be grateful that we have the ability to be able to live the lives that we lead in this great country. But there's a stain, a distinct, disgusting, irremovable, toxic stain that sits with this country. And it is around Indigenous people. And people will argue, well, you know, we've had the referendum and that tells us what most people think. No, that tells us what most people were convinced, because prior to the referendum, 67% of people thought that the referendum was a good idea. So people were swayed to think something different. So somehow people were able to tap into the racism that sits in this country. And as long as we ignore our racist tendencies, as long as we ignore what we have done to Indigenous people, we will never be the country we could be. We're a great country as it is, but we could be much, much better. So let me know. There'll be lots of people who will disagree with me, and I understand that and I appreciate that. Doesn't mean you're right, I hasten to add, as it doesn't mean I'm right either by saying what I've just said. But we can be much better than we are. And Indigenous people need to be recognised for what has happened to them. You know, when I think, there are many examples where there have been pockets of individuals who have suffered because of government decisions, whatever, and I think the ones I worked with the most were Vietnam vets. Now, Vietnam veterans got a raw deal when they came back to this country. for a whole host of reasons. I'm not going to talk about that now, but I can tell you this much, that there has been a way to try and remunerate, to compensate for what has happened to Vietnam vets in terms of their health care and their pensions and a whole host of other things. Now, maybe, just maybe, we should think about putting those same sorts of issues forward for Indigenous people. You know, the health issues that Indigenous people have been brought about through colonisation, as I said. The poverty that sits with Indigenous communities has been there because they have been ignored. Because at some level, we've always thought of them as lesser than the white people or those people that have settled here. And at some point, somewhere along the line, someone has to say, and Albanese at least tried to do this, has to say that things need to change. That we need to recognise Indigenous people differently than the way that we have. There is there's a Wikipedia describes Australia Day in this way, but what I wanted to highlight was that it was not until 1935 that all Australian states and territories adopted and used the term Australia Day to mark the day of the 1788 landing of the first fleet in Sydney Cove. And not until 1994 that 26th of January was consistently marked as a public holiday, and that day by all states and territories. And it was originally called Foundation Day, I hasten to add. So when people start to think about, I asked my mates at golf today, when they thought that Australia Day became a reality. And it's been there in dribs and drabs for quite some time, but it hasn't been officially a day to celebrate until 1994. So it's only in recent times that we've come to understand Australia Day as a day in which we have holiday and it's a national holiday. So when you're thinking about Australia Day, remember that it's only recently that we've adopted the term in the way that we have and are supposed to enact it today. So I'm asking you to think about, what does Australia Day mean to you? What are you going to do on Friday next week? How do you go about celebrating? And if you're going out celebrating it by getting pissed and having a barbecue, well, explain to me how that's celebrating Australia Day. I think we should be celebrating Australian Day by at least acknowledging what we did to Indigenous people, speak to Indigenous people about what this means to them, and accept whatever term they think should be used on this day that they were colonised. And if they say Invasion Day it should be. So let me know what you think in the comments below. I'll be making more videos in relation to Australia Day in the next few days. But let me know what you think, and also remember to subscribe to my channel and ring the bell. Thanks everybody for being with me. Take care, look after yourselves, and more importantly, be safe.